Hi everybody and welcome to Mark Overanalyzes Film. Before I begin, I've been away for a while, I apologise, but there are exciting things in the works. Sadly though, in my absence we got the news that David Lynch passed, so what better way to return than with Mulholland Drive, a film that just begs to be overanalysed. Unsurprisingly, Mulholland Drive is tricky to analyse, so I'm going to start by setting up just what I think Mulholland Drive is and how it actually works. Then I'll go through the beats of the story to show how all of that, kind of maps. And finally, I'd like to end on a note about the art and the craft of David Lynch and just what made him so special, basically. To begin, I'm going to talk about what Mulholland Drive actually is, what it means, and what the dream that dominates the story actually consists of. So, Mulholland Drive started as a TV pilot. However, the pilot got cancelled, and eventually David Lynch came up with an idea as to how to make it a feature. So, after a brief opening scene here, the next 95 minutes is mostly footage from that pilot. And then the last 45 minutes were added later to contextualize what had come before. In this regard, the two most pivotal scenes are the Club Silencio sequence that creates a segue from the dream world of the pilot to the real world, and the dinner in the third act, which is really our inciting incident for the whole film. So, what's actually going on here? Camilla Rhodes cruelly invites Diane to a dinner where she and Adam Kesher announce their engagement, despite the fact that Camilla also flagrantly kisses another young, beautiful blonde woman in front of Diane. This is so painful to Diane, and she feels so rejected and so denigrated that it leads to her hiring a hitman to kill her former lover. The guilt of that action being completed, confirmed with the appearance of a blue key, sends Diane into a deep depression. In this depressed state, she falls asleep and has a dream where everything gets a far sunnier but creepily uncanny recontextualization, except that her subconscious knows that this is all wrong and won't let the dream version survive. Once she wakes, she can't live with the guilt of what she's done and the sense of how far she has fallen, and she kills herself. Now from here on out, I am basically going to be talking as if everything David Lynch did throughout was intentional, but it's really hard to know because not many people know what the original TV series would have entailed. So all we can do is analyze the end result that we have and attempt to ground that analysis as much as possible. And of course there will be the occasional wild swing. Okay, so what does this all mean then? Now, just to get this out of the way, a lot of people say this film doesn't really make sense. That, it's basically a bunch of really good scenes that go together. In fact, I think Roger Ebert said something like, the way you know the film is over is that it ends. And that's just not correct, I think. Almost everything in this film, I would argue, is almost painstakingly contextualized. But also, I've often seen this described as a film about Hollywood. But, that's not incorrect. But it doesn't say much. Any story of any value has to say something about the human condition. The way a story does that is by embodying a need in its protagonist. The protagonist lacks some kind of piece of wisdom or human truth, and they will hopefully embrace it by the end. So to my mind, Mulholland Drive is all about a person who wraps her self-worth around being chosen by someone else and feeling special. And then what happens when she is rejected and feels thrown away? It is not pretty. In fact, it's terrifying. In the opening moments of this film, Diane is depicted as exultant under a spotlight. She has been chosen, and she has never felt happier or more special. and beside her stand her impossibly proud and ecstatic parents. At the end of that first sequence, though, a man in a dark suit, Dan, approaches a corner behind a diner, and out springs a terrifying looking man, who is actually played by a woman and who is described in the script as a bum with black fungus on their face. And, well, this is all a product of Diane's subconscious. And what is more rejected than a bum behind a diner in LA? In Blue Velvet, David Lynch pointed out the darkness that lies underneath picket fence niceness in suburban America. Here, there's a sense that there's darkness around every corner. There are so many ominous corners in this film during the dream sequence, and that's because there's darkness in Diane's psyche. We might all want to be Betty, but deep down, there's a part of us that is, or feels like, this bum. And it is terrifying to think how far we could fall, especially if you're someone like Diane. And so that bum is pushed to the periphery of our consciousness, but it's still there, and it still contains truth. That's why Dan needs help confronting it. That's why the sight of them scares him so much that he dies on the spot. And that's why at the end, it is this dark corner of the subconscious, the part that Diane worries deep down she really is when she's not in this spotlight and feeling special, that releases the spirits of her once impossibly proud and ecstatic parents. It's the memory of how proud these parents once were and the feeling of just how far she's fallen that causes Diane to make her final, awful decision. This tension between how high we can feel when we are chosen and how impossibly low we can feel when we are rejected, that, for my money, is the thematic idea that connects Diane's professional and personal experience here. Hollywood is Camilla, Camilla is Hollywood. She's beautiful, she's impossibly glamorous, she makes Diane feel special and chosen, and she's cold, capricious, and sometimes cruel. She chooses Diane and then sets her aside and moves on to the next pretty young thing. This is a story about Hollywood because there's no better setting for that idea or theme than Hollywood. But Diane has a need to face reality and move on. The tragedy of Mulholland Drive is her complete and utter failure to meet her need to do just that. That's why Mulholland Drive doesn't just feel, cynical or something like that. That's why it feels bleak. Okay, third then. Diane has this dream, but what is the dream actually made of? What does it consist of? And there's a lot to get into here, so let me talk about the ingredients that seem to go into shaping this creation of Diane's subconscious, because it's so important to understanding how this story actually works. The first and most obvious factor that shapes this world is, of course, Diane's own experiences. Diane's subconscious is taking tangible elements from her own life and remixing them. Diane herself is really fractured, but there's a clear avatar in Betty, a standard blue key that seems to open nothing but reveals death and murder, becomes a mysterious triangular key that leads to a terrible truth. And, I don't know, maybe it's triangular because it comes from a love triangle, but that might be being far too literal, I'm not sure. There is actually quite a lot of literalism in this, so that may well be the case. A terrible moment in a car for Diane becomes a car accident. In the dream, Camilla becomes Rita. Adam becomes a director of the Sylvia North story, even though that was Bob Brooker in reality. Camilla's new lover becomes an actress at the center of a mafia plot in Hollywood, and so on and so on. The cowboy, the waitress, the espresso drinker, they're all here. The second factor is Diane's emotional state, and this exhibits itself in two ways, I'd argue. For one, the pervading sense of unease throughout the dream. For two, there are the moments of subconscious breakthroughs, Louise Bonner, the old woman who lives next door and knows that something is very, very wrong. The cowboy who turns up to give Diane, in the form of Adam, a lecture on the fact that they have forsaken the good life. The key breakthrough is the emotional catharsis in Club Silencio of seeing a woman express heartbreak by singing Roy Orbison's Crying in Spanish, while at the same time, Betty and Rita are repeatedly being told that none of this is real. The third factor is related, and it's Diane's wishes and desires. Diane's emotions appear to be driving the subconscious to recontextualize elements to save her the pain of the truth. Betty appears to be the way that Diane wishes she were. Camilla is reimagined as a helpless amnesiac who needs Betty to save her, whereas the actual director of the Sylvia North story, Bob Brooker, didn't think much of Diane. Adam seems to fall immediately in love with her, but he is forced in the dream to choose another woman in her stead because of a mafia plot. As such, this other actress is undermined in this version of the story, when in reality Camilla almost certainly chose her as a new lover over Diane freely. Bob Brooker, for his sins, is made the director of a film that will never get made, and he's made to look ridiculous and out of step when everyone else adores Betty on the spot. But there is something subtler as well going on here, which provides context for Mulholland Drive's most surreal moments, I'd say. The fourth factor, and this one is my favourite, is kind of a mix of the first three, and it's Diane's subconscious mixing real events with her internal emotions, and then literalizing that mix in her dream storytelling. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, so let me give some examples. In a meeting with Adam, a mafioso drinks an espresso and spits it out to the horror of the executives. But this bizarre moment is actually kind of perfectly explained in our third act dinner scene, or at least contextualized. At the moment Diane drinks an espresso in this scene, she sees this same man in the restaurant. The fact that she almost certainly wants to retch at her situation and Adam's insufferably smug story is inverted here in this earlier moment, when this man gets to gag in front of Adam, who has in turn no power in this version of the scene. Similarly, when Adam returns home soon after, he discovers his wife in bed with the pool cleaner. The surreality of this beat comes from the fact that Adam's wife is so upfront about it and blames Adam for having the temerity to draw attention to her cheating. Again, just like the espresso moment, the absurdity feels comedic, but is a bizarre retelling of Diane's trauma. At dinner in the third act, Adam tells the story of how he caught his wife with the pool boy, but in the very next moment, Camilla cheats on both him and Diane by kissing another woman openly. Adam either doesn't notice or doesn't care, but Diane's humiliation is compounded by the fact that she cannot react. In the dream, though, Diane's psyche can lash out, so Adam pours pink paint all over his wife's jewelry and gets it all over his black clothes. Pink just so happens to be the color of the dress that this other woman wears when she kisses Camilla at the party. So, the fifth and final factor that I can deduce, at least, is the actress Diane's subconscious film references. They are hints to what is really happening in and of themselves. Now, I'm sure there's loads that I've missed, but Gilda, Sunset Boulevard, Vertigo, and The Wizard of Oz are all really heavily referenced throughout, and they all contain hints as to what's really going on. Just as one example, Rita names herself after Rita Hayworth upon seeing the poster for Gilda. Gilda is a film about two lovers who have a romantic history that they must keep hidden from a powerful man that Gilda has married. Right at the midpoint of that film, Gilda tells her former lover that she hates him so much she would destroy herself to take him down with her. And guess what happens at the midpoint of Mulholland Drive? Diane tells her former lover that she hates her and herself, although it is inadvertent that she does so. And Diane will, of course, eventually destroy them both. Just a final note on all of these films. They all fit into the generally timeless air of the dream as well. There is modern technology and fashion, but everyone in the dream kind of acts like it was a movie from a much earlier period of Hollywood. Okay, I know that is a lot of setup, but I just really want to be clear. Yes, this film is absolutely abstract, but it is anything but random or an incoherent collection of scenes that just stand on their own. You know, when we analyze it this way, I hope it's pretty clear what this film is, what it means, and what the dream that dominates it consists of. And with that fundamental basis, now let's have a look at the acts and sequences of Mulholland Drive to see how it tells its story. A sequence is a combination of scenes that are tied together by having a single overriding dramatic question or tension, and they tend to be between 10 and 15 minutes in length. A good way to think about it is that every 10 to 15 minutes, the audience should be on some level asking themselves a different dramatic question. So here we've got 3 acts. The first act will have 2 sequences. The second act, which dominates the film, will have 6. And the third act, once again, has 2. So Act 1 has 2 sequences, and the first one is always life as it is. But first, Mulholland Drive actually begins with an unusual musical scene, which I think is pretty easy to forget. 4 vaguely retro-looking couples dance against a purple background. Except the profiles of these 4 dancing couples also perforate that purple background. And behind that purple background, there is the same 4 dancing couples. Layers and layers of 4 couples dancing with nothing else. And then Diane doesn't so much emerge as much as she is placed in front of these people. The spotlight is upon her. She has been chosen. 2 older people, who I am going to presume are her parents, are with her, and none have ever been happier. Then the background transitions to our second event. We're in first person mode here, and someone, presumably Diane, falls into her rich maroon pillow to sleep, to dream, and possibly to forget. Then, finally, we have our title, Mulholland Drive. In my view, what we have just seen is the jitterbug competition that Diane describes winning as it felt to her, and the moment when she falls asleep to have the dream that will dominate the bulk of this film. The rest of this sequence will set up the world of this dream. Now, mostly that is setting up how this mystery woman ends up in Betty's aunt's house, and how a mysterious cabal appears to be searching for her. It's important to note that this is expressed through a series of phone calls, the last of which we will discover much later is a call placed to Diane's phone, placed beside a notable red lampshade. Now, nobody answers it, directly at least, but suddenly, at that, we cut to Betty arriving in our story. Now, in between all of this, we have a scene with one of the most infamous jump scares of the last 25 years. In a diner, a man in a dark suit, Dan, asks his friend Herb to come with him so he can confirm that a terrifying man is not behind the diner like he has dreamed. But as they are about to turn the corner, a terrifying bum with a face black with fungus, as they're described in the script, suddenly, unnaturally slides out. At the sight of this man, Dan dies on the spot. Now, I've covered what I believe the bum represents, but I should also point out that this is kind of Diane's subconscious telling her that there is a connection between dreams and reality. But anyways, Betty arrives in LA, deposited at the airport exit by a terrifyingly ecstatic elderly couple, again who I consider representations of Diane's parents here, and Betty has an objective. So we have a tension. Will Betty move into her new home? So Betty arrives at Havenhurst, meets Coco, and is soon in place. She wanders around the house, into the bathroom, and sees a person in the shower. And it's no coincidence that the first time Betty sees Rita, she's both naked or bare and refracted. So it appears at the same time as though there is no one clear whole person there, and at the same time there is also multiple versions of the same person behind the shower door. That's just classic Lynchian visual symbolism at play. But this is also really the tension we've had for this sequence. Betty has arrived in her place, and our two main characters have finally encountered one another. Every Act 2 has a tangible objective that allows the protagonist to drive the plot forward, and Betty's is right around the corner now, as she's going to help Rita figure out who she is. And so this feels as good a time as any to say that we're leaving Act 1 and entering Act 2. So this is the beginning of our long Act 2, and in this part of any story, we have what we call the what's the plan scene. Now this is a scene, or maybe a couple of scenes, that tells the audience what they can expect the long middle of our story to look like. So you might notice a lot gets set up here. We discovered this woman doesn't know her name, so she takes the name Rita. Betty explains she's here to become a great actress and a movie star. We see that she has an impulse to take care of Rita, and we're soon going to cut to the other main plot of this story, Adam Kesher's fight to protect his own made-up story. And this all really tells us how Act 2 is going to go. But there's a couple of things to note in this first big scene between Betty and Rita, because David Lynch has actually riddled this story with hints as to what is happening. First, this woman takes the name Rita from the Gilda poster. Then Betty tells Rita her aunt is working on a movie in Canada, which is apparently a Hollywood expression to say that someone is dead or has disappeared. Then, more importantly, Betty tells Rita that she has arrived here in this quote-unquote dream place. At these words, Rita suddenly stumbles backwards, as if receiving a blow to the head. Finally, Betty says they should call for help, and Rita refuses, saying that she just needs to sleep, which is again exactly what Diane is doing in reality. And there's one more thing to note here, especially on this final beat. This first sequence of Act 2 is always defined by two things. First, we have a retrenchment away from the protagonist's need. So again, Betty needs to face reality and move on, or I should say Diane does. The protagonist will try to go back, though, at this beat to their coping mechanism and their way of being in Act 1. So you might notice that Rita, just like Diane, is hoping to avoid facing the problem and that sleep will make the problem go away. Furthermore, she's in a state of mind where she does not recall her own name and she takes on the name of someone else. For her part, Betty is doting on Rita. So this is a classic example of initial retrenchment from the need in a second act.
I mean, I just came here from Deep River, Ontario, and now I'm in this dream place. Well, you can imagine how I feel. Oh, what? are you hurt? Oh, we should call a doctor.
No.
But this could be serious.
No, I need to sleep.
If you have a concussion, you shouldn't sleep.
It'll be okay if I sleep.
This also introduces our first tension of Act 2. Will Rita remember anything when she wakes up? But this is a tension that Rita and Betty are passive in, and so it's time to introduce our B-plot, Adam Kesher, and why he chooses another woman over Diane/Betty. We join Adam as he's being railroaded to choose an actress by the name of Camilla Rhodes for his new film. The woman he is being coerced into choosing just so happens to be the woman who the real Camilla has chosen over Diane. But the point is that there's a compounding in Diane's subconscious here. She is retelling the story of how she did not get a huge part, but she's also attempting to create a sort of elaborate explanation for why Camilla has chosen this other blonde actress over her as a lover. But both parts are about being chosen, or in this case, being rejected. But for the moment, Adam is told that this, Camilla Rhodes, is the girl, and he flies out of the meeting, which is another retrenchment away from where this is all going to end up. But the forces of antagonism are not about to be defeated by these first attempts by our heroes, so they begin to up their game. A power broker behind the scenes tells the studio to shut down production, a hitman turns up, murders someone involved in Rita's accident, and starts asking around about Rita. Now this is one of those wild swings that I was talking about because I just can't leave this be. In reality, this hitman has two blue eyes. In the dream world, his left eye is blue, but his right eye is dark brown. I really don't know why that is, but my first thought was that he has one blue eye like Betty and Diane and one brown eye like Rita and Camilla, as he is the bridge between Diane and Camilla's death. But that is purely an instinctual reaction on my part from noticing the detail, nothing more. More importantly though, Diane talks to her aunt on the phone and discovers something is amiss. She then finds Rita awake and crying, and Rita admits that she does not remember who she is. So, sleeping didn't help Rita, and our sequence tension has now been resolved. And so at minute 42, this sequence finishes, and this is where we have our protagonists' first unconscious move towards their need. It is the first substantial move towards where they are eventually headed, or at least where we hope they are headed. And it's regarded as an unconscious move because it is generally in reaction to something external and not pre-planned. And so, Betty opens Rita's bag and discovers a big wad of cash and a mysterious blue key. These are the clues they have to find out what really happened to Rita, and they are, of course, the items Diane associates with her own awful moment in the diner. So, this is a big step towards Diane facing the truth and attempting to move on, if she can. And so, at that, it's time we entered Sequence 4, the greater attempts to solve the problem, as we wonder, will Betty be able to help Rita remember something? And the two women do start to make strides, but as they do, we once again have a surreal experience with Adam. He refuses to come into the office and returns home, only to discover his wife in bed with the pool cleaner, and soon gets kicked out of his own house. But while this is going on, Rita recalls that she was headed to Mulholland Drive. So the women head to a payphone. Again, clues abound here as Betty says, it'll be just like in the movies, we can pretend to be someone else. And so they discover that there was an accident on Mulholland Drive. And soon inside a familiar looking diner, Rita discovers something else. A waitress's name tag triggers something for her. The women rush home, Rita tells Betty she remembers the name Diane Selwyn, and they call the number in the phone book. And once more, in a key moment, there is a hint, a big one. Betty declares it's strange to be calling yourself. And she's right because she doesn't realize it, but she hears her own voice as Diane on the message.
strange to be calling yourself.
Maybe it's not me.
Hello, it's me. Leave a message.
It's not my voice. But I know her.
This is a really important beat in the story. We've answered the sequence tension, and so to my mind, we now move into sequence 5, the sequence that will take us to Mulholland Drive's midpoint. The midpoint is really the core of our story. A platonic ideal of a midpoint should do several things more or less at once. One, it should generally raise the stakes of our story. 2, it should foreshadow our eventual climax. But most importantly, for me at least, 3, it should contain the protagonist's first conscious move towards their need. Now, I think all 3 of these things are accomplished, but they are slightly spread out over a couple of scenes, I think, as we'll see. Now, the sequence tension here is really, will Adam confront the people who are strong-arming him? First, they send a heavy to his house, then they track him down where he's staying with a man called Cookie. Finally, Adam talks to his assistant, who tells him to visit the cowboy. There is another slightly odd note where Adam's assistant Cynthia propositions him, and he dismisses the idea out of hand. And, well, maybe it's not that odd that a director who looks like Justin Theroux is being propositioned out of nowhere, but again, it's later implied that Camilla got a part over Diane because she slept with the director, so this again feels like it could be a kind of wish fulfillment on Diane's part, that Adam the director would not be the least interested in sleeping with women vying for his attention. But anyways, Adam agrees to visit the cowboy, but before he does, there's another one of Mulholland Drive's creepiest moments, and it is the first real midpoint scene in my view. As Betty and Rita discover where Diane Selwyn lives, a troubled older woman, Louise Bonner, suddenly shows up at their door. Louise declares that Betty is not this blonde woman's name and that someone is in trouble. When Coco turns up, Louise then tells her that someone is in her room and won't leave. It's all pretty unsettling and all very open to interpretation. But as far as I'm concerned, this lady seems to have been triggered by the discovery of Diane's actual address and the decision to go there. Diane's avatar Betty is unwittingly choosing to come home, which triggers this breakthrough of someone telling her that her name is not actually Betty. But Betty is not ready to hear it yet, so it's managed and dismissed. But the fact that this character, who appears to be a facet of Diane's subconscious breaking through, says that there's someone in her apartment who won't leave, is highly suggestive of the concept that Diane's head is filled with people who won't leave. She has been tormented by her memories of Camilla, and the film will end with her unable to lock the idea of her parental figures out of her apartment. So Louise's warning raises the stakes for sure. There's something really creepy about this, and the idea that her room is haunted and that someone not called Betty is in trouble really foreshadows our climax. And Betty has been told that her name is not in fact Betty, and that something is really not right here, which feels like there's a real breakthrough in the story. So this has a lot of the hallmarks of a midpoint. But for me, we still need Betty to make a more conscious move towards her need. But we will see that very soon. For now though, Adam visits the cowboy, and there's 2 big things to note here. This is the turning point for Adam. Up until this point, he's been a smart aleck, feeling above the fray. But there's something unnerving about the resoluteness and sure-footedness of this cowboy that gets through to him. We shall see that Adam will now play ball, and it's because of this meeting. But there's something more thematic going on. The cowboy asks Adam to consider 2 statements. 1. A man's attitude goes some ways to the way his life will be. And since Adam agrees with that, 2, he must be a person who does not care about the good life. Now, once again, in abstraction, this feels intimidating but surreal, and it should be noted that the cowboy is rigging a process for the mafia with a vague threat of menace in this moment. However, I think there's every argument to be made here that Adam is a refraction of Diane's psyche, and we are foreshadowing our climax. Diane seems to feel as though she did have a good attitude and got nowhere for it, and then she had a bad attitude, forsook the good life, and is now cursed with the consequences. In sum, a good attitude will only get you so far, and may not get you anywhere. After all, Betty does not get a job in the end of this next sequence, but a bad attitude, that'll bury you, and indeed, it will bury Diane. So Adam has finally confronted the people chasing him, and it appears he will break. And at that, our sequence tension is answered, and we're at minute 70 of a 143-minute runtime, a perfect time for what I consider Mulholland Drive's midpoint. Again, the most important facet of a midpoint for me is that it is a protagonist's first conscious move towards their need. So it's something premeditated and thought through, and it tells us where she will end up. And so, at Mulholland Drive's midpoint, Betty, or Diane if you want to interpret it that way, and Rita try and fail to pretend to be other people in an enactment. Rita in particular is wooden and acting like an empty puppet, but there's something else going on here as well. As silly as the scene appears at first glance, it's once again a refraction of a story much closer to reality than the one being presented to us. So let me outline that reality before we play the clip. Diane had been scorned by Camilla, then Camilla reappeared and invited her to a dinner all of a sudden, then degraded her there. At any point, Diane could probably go back home to her parents, but she'd be ashamed to do so. Further, if Camilla had not come back into Diane's life, Diane probably wouldn't have organized to have her killed. And the reason? Because Diane not only hates Camilla, she hates them both. Now, with all that in mind, let's listen to the so-called lame scene they're acting out.
You're still here?
I came back. I thought that's what you wanted.
Nobody wants you here.
Really?
My parents are right upstairs. They think you've left.
So, surprise.
I can call them. I can call my dad.
But you won't.
If you're trying to blackmail me, it's not gonna work. You're playing a dangerous game here.
You know what I want. It's not that difficult.
Get out. Get out before I call my dad. He trusts you. You're his best friend. This will be the end of everything.
What about you? What will your dad think about you?
Stop! Just stop it! That's what you said from the beginning! Now, if I tell what happened, they'll arrest you and put you in jail, so get out of here before...
Before what?
Before I kill you.
Then they'd put you in jail.
Then I cry, and then I say with big emotion, I hate you! I hate us both!
This is a breakthrough for Diane, and it triggers our next sequence tension as we wonder, will Betty nail her audition? And at that, we enter sequence 6, Mulholland Drive's honeymoon sequence. The honeymoon sequence is so called because, having acted in accordance with their need, the protagonist tends to be rewarded in some way. And you'll notice two really big things here. One, everything goes phenomenally for Betty in this sequence. And two, this is the only time in Act 2 that we see Betty without Rita. You could interpret this as a sign that she is embracing a way of being that is unattached to the weight of the past, or that she is individuating and becoming more herself in the absence of Rita, or it could be both. And this is what leads to one of the scenes that's arguably the most famous of Mulholland Drive, the audition. out of nowhere, this sweet as apple pie, gosh darn good kid and super lady reveals something else. Something more full-blooded. Something much more carnal. She plays the second enactment of the scene far, far sexier than the first, even grabbing the other actor's hand to get him to grope her. It is the first moment where this person reveals herself to be a deeply sexual being, and it's no coincidence that this happens in the honeymoon sequence. Another hint comes here though. Everyone thinks Betty is so amazing that the casting agent takes her to see another director about another film. On the way, she declares that she's going to show Betty a project that she will, quote unquote, kill. On the word kill, Betty jarringly looks really shocked by it, and the agent immediately rephrases with, knock right out of the park. The rephrasing reassures Betty immediately, as if just for a moment there was the faintest unpleasant reminder of something that was quickly shaken off. And that brings us to another critical scene, and one that will end this honeymoon sequence. Betty is brought to Adam's set as he auditions actresses. And there's so much going on here. As the script says, when Betty and Adam first see each other, they each seem to feel the thrill of the thunderbolt. But at this same moment, Adam is forced into casting a lesser actress, which just so happens to be Diane's romantic nemesis in real life. Almost triggered by that, Betty suddenly looks at her watch, appears to be afraid of what she's feeling when Adam looks at her, and rushes off to return to the safety of Rita. This is the complication that will end the honeymoon sequence, because apparently Diane and Betty can only leave Camilla and Rita so far behind. Or perhaps talking to Adam would be a stretch too far for the Gossamer dream. Regardless, Betty's audition went brilliantly, but she's not gotten a job out of it. So our sequence tension is answered. At minute 88, we wonder our new tension. Will Betty and Rita discover the truth at Diane's apartment? Our honeymoon sequence is over, and it's time we entered the next stage of our story, the bridge from the honeymoon to the low point.
Oh my goodness. I have to be somewhere. I promised a friend. I'm sorry. I must go now.
So Betty and Rita finally travel to Diane Selwyn's address, and they soon break into Diane's apartment and find a horrifying, rotting corpse. Again, it's hard to say who this is meant to be and what exactly it's meant to represent. It appears to have been a blonde, but with hair of about Rita's length, which again kind of makes this corpse in some ways appear like a cross between Diane and Camilla. One way to interpret it is that this corpse is in the exact same spot that we will find Diane asleep later on. So Betty and Rita have gone to the root of this dream, and they've found only death. And this revelation is so shocking for Rita in particular that she runs out, and her personhood, as well as Betty's, starts to blur, as if neither of them is one discrete person. And so she soon returns to Betty's apartment, cuts her hair, and dons a short blonde wig, as if she were trying to look like Betty. And interestingly, Betty says, "You look like someone else," as if she's slowly realizing that they are actually representations of the same person. So, to recap quickly, at minute 28, Rita lies about her name. At minute 42, she admits that she doesn't remember her name, and they discover the blue key. At minute 55, Rita recalls the name Diane Selwyn. At minute 70, Rita and Betty inadvertently act out a scene that echoes what happened in real life. At minute 88, Betty runs away after another woman is chosen ahead of her. At minute 96, they discover a dead body, and Rita begins to look like Diane. So when we put this all together, we can see that this is not only heading towards Rita discovering that she is either Diane or does not exist, depending on your interpretation, but along the way, we're also discovering all of the backstory. Now all we need to do is confirm everything, and so it's time for sequence 8, the sequence that's going to take us to the end of Act 2 and the low point of Mulholland Drive. Now this is the moment when the original pilot meets the newly shot footage for the film, and you can really see it when you look. Not only that, but you can see where the story takes something of a hard turn, because before the next tension really kicks in, these two women suddenly act on the sexual tension between them. And this is again where the dream feels surreal, but is really an expression of reality. As they begin to make love, Betty tells this amnesiac woman who she's known for 2 days that she is in love with her. And you'll notice neither woman answers directly when asked if they've done this before. Rita says she doesn't know, and Betty says she wants to with Rita. But soon after, they're both asleep within a dream. And maybe because of that inaction within the dream itself, there is a breakthrough. At minute 103, Rita has a sudden urge to go somewhere, and we wonder, will the women find an answer to this mystery at Club Silencio? Nothing feels more David Lynch here than the Club Silencio sequence, and it's brilliant. I love it. Almost everything up until this point has been a dream, remembering but remixing and reimagining a reality that has been. At Club Silencio, the magician declares, "No hay banda." This is all a recording, and what David Lynch does so brilliantly is that he tells us, repeatedly, this is all an illusion, and then he shows us a trumpet player as the trumpet plays, and our brain cannot help but say, well, that trumpet player is playing the trumpet. And then he shows us, again, no, this is an illusion, I've told you that. And even then, a singer comes out and sings the most beautiful version of Roy Orbison's Crying. And once again, we can't help but get caught up in what we think we see before our eyes and the emotion that it conveys, even though we've been told, and then shown again, that this is an illusion. The film is telling us that everything we see before us is an illusion. We just cannot help but get caught up in the emotion and the storytelling of it, because that's how our brains work, that's how film works. But yet, through this, there is realization. Aristotle believed that the whole point of drama was to achieve catharsis, as a way to purify ourselves of excess emotion and to gain clarity. And so, even while Betty and Rita are troubled by what they are experiencing, they are thoroughly moved by Rebecca Del Rio's incredible performance of Llorando. And this cathartic release for Betty of seeing someone else experiencing her pain causes her to cry. She reaches for tissues in her purse, but instead she discovers a blue box with a hole for a triangular key. The performance is fake, but the emotion is real, and that realization is the key to reality. And so, the women do seem to have found something in Club Silencio. They rush home, and as Betty places the box on the bed, Rita reaches up to get the key, and when she turns around, Betty has disappeared. Almost certainly because the truth is at hand, and this version of Diane has no place in it. And so, Rita opens the blue box to find a void that she appears to get sucked into. And at that, the dream is over, and even if it's not initially obvious, the tangible objective of Act 2 has been achieved. Rita has no memory because she exists only in Diane's head. Just a quick note on the blue box. There's no way to see something like this and not think of Pandora's box, in my view. And with that in mind, as we see the box fall to the ground with its lid still open, it's natural to think one of two things. One, we are seeing all of the evils of the world escaping and thus bringing us back to reality. Or two, the box contained hope. This dream was Diane's only remaining hope, and by unlocking the box in the dream, they have let hope escape. But in reality, the blue key represents the death of Camilla. Later on, Diane will ask what the key opens, and the hitman can only laugh at her. What does it matter? The key could open anything, but what the key undeniably reveals is the evil that is within Diane. And once that evil is revealed, neither Rita nor the dream can survive it. This is the end of Act 2 and the low point of our story. At the low point, at any low point, the protagonist no longer believes the thematic counter-argument, but the thematic argument seems impossible. And so, Diane is no longer fooling herself. She knows who she is and what she's done, but she does not know how she can possibly move on and live with that knowledge. It's a textbook low point, and so that means it's time, with about 28 minutes left, that we end Act 2 and we enter Act 3. Act 3 contains a false resolution and a true resolution. And now, for the first time, we see the true Diane. It appears she really did swap apartments with her neighbour, as in the dream, and presumably to avoid the cops. And we see that she is not the bubbly, effervescent Betty. She's a broken, bitter, difficult woman, even to a neighbour helping her out. And what follows here is a quick series of daydreams and time jumps to explain why she is this way, why she's so heartbroken, why she's so broken in general. She turns around and just for a second she imagines seeing Camilla looking radiant. But she's not there. The only person here is Diane, and she hates herself for even daring to hold those fleeting hopes. But she's stuck in depressed wallowing. She makes coffee and it triggers a memory of bringing a drink to a naked Camilla on her couch. They fool around and Camilla reveals that they will not be able to keep doing this, which in turn triggers the memory of Diane first seeing Camilla kissing the director Adam Kesher and seeming to revel in taunting Diane by doing so in front of her. And to be fair, for her part, Diane seems violent and possessive and does not take rejection well, so these two didn't seem to have a perfectly healthy thing going.
I shouldn't do this anymore.
Don't say that. Don't ever say that.
Don't, Diane. Stop it. Diane, stop. I've tried to tell you this before.
It's him, isn't it?
And just a note here, Naomi Watts is incredible. The range that she exhibits in just these few scenes, let alone the whole film, is just amazing. But anyways, like any good false resolution, this one ends with our devastated, broken protagonist violently, desperately masturbating. But this is not going to end the story of a woman who takes out all of her feelings of rejection and self-hatred on herself. And so at minute 127, with 16 minutes left, we begin to find out where all of this really led. And so, with the familiar looking red telephone ringing, it's time for Mulholland Drive's true resolution. Diane is invited to a party by Camilla, a car picks her up, and it stops right at the spot where Rita was stopped at the start of the film. And just like when Rita was stopped, something terrible happens here. And the next two scenes really explain almost everything we've seen to a truly impressive degree. We meet Adam and discover that he's marrying Camilla. We discover that Coco is actually his mother. We discover that Diane won a jitterbug contest that made her want to get into acting. We discover that her aunt is dead and left her money that she then used to move to Hollywood. We discovered that Diane met Camilla when she was starring in the Sylvia North story. We discovered that Camilla speaks Spanish, which adds context for its use in Club Silencio. We discovered that Camilla probably slept with the director Bob Brooker, who didn't care for Diane. We discovered that Camilla helped Diane get parts in her films, which Coco seems to intuit as essentially a sexual predator's methodology. we discovered that Adam really did divorce his wife after an incident with a poolman. We see the espresso man from earlier. We discovered that Camilla seems to have moved on to another beautiful young blonde lover, and that she is still taunting Diane with her other sexual pursuits. As this young blonde woman walks away, she's passed by a cowboy, as if he's orchestrating things behind the scenes. And finally, we discovered that Adam and Camilla are getting married, and that Diane simply cannot stand all of this hurt, rejection, and humiliation. And so we enter our real climax. Diane goes to a familiar-looking diner, hires a hitman, sees a waitress named Betty, and a familiar-looking man at the register. She reveals a familiar-looking wad of money in her handbag, and the hitman reveals a familiar-looking blue key. He tells her when it's finished, she will find this blue key. And so, this blue key becomes the signifier of Camilla's death and Diane's hand in it. The camera goes back around the diner as it did early on, and this time we see that the terrifying man is a bum on the street. The bum places the blue box in a paper bag, and out of it comes Diane and or Betty's parental figures, still terrifyingly ecstatic. At home, Diane stares traumatized at the blue key on her table, like the beating from under the floorboards from the telltale heart. Haunted by what it means, she is tormented by those ecstatic parental figures that she cannot lock out of her house. She cannot bear it, and so she lunges across her bed and shoots herself. We return one more time to Club Silencio, which washes itself with the blue light of death. There is no recording, there is no dream, there is no dreamer, there's only the quiet of death. And so the woman on the balcony whispers at last, Silencio. Okay, so that's a lot of Mulholland Drive. But just to close out, I would like to talk about my mixed feelings slightly on how people interpret David Lynch. It seems impossibly fitting to me that the standout sequence in David Lynch's most well-regarded film is about a group of magicians creating emotionally devastating illusions that tell us something essentially true. The whole point of this kind of magic is that we know it's an illusion, we know it's not real, and yet we cannot help but be affected by it. We know realistically that it's a trick, we just don't understand it. And to understand the trick is arguably to steal it of its power. What great magician wants to have their magic trick explained, and how many in the audience really want to know? So that gives me some pause for doing what I'm doing right here. On the other hand, to believe that there isn't coherence, cohesion, and thematic and dramatic unity to Mulholland Drive, well, it's not just wrong, it doesn't just give rise to awful imitators that learn all the wrong lessons. It feels to me like an insult to David Lynch. No film, no story could possibly be this good, this interesting, and this powerful if it did not fundamentally make sense. But the real power of cinematic storytelling is that it can bypass our verbal, logical, conscious minds. It can somehow speak directly to our subconscious. The magic of cinematic storytelling is that we know that it makes sense, and we know that deep down we do understand it, at least on some level, but we can't explain it, or at least it's very difficult to do so. And that's why it feels so fun, vital even, to talk about a David Lynch film after, especially with the people that you've seen it with. If it didn't make sense, if it wasn't actually quote unquote about anything, talking about it would be largely pointless. Similarly, if it was really obvious and uninteresting, there'd be little to discuss and likely little truth in it. David Lynch's genius was that he created films that we felt we understood even when we couldn't explain how. David Lynch made us peer deep within ourselves to see what he clearly saw inside of us. David Lynch made us think and probe and talk and truly discuss. David Lynch made films that pierced us and made us more open to the world and the world more open to us. David Lynch was a magician. David Lynch made pure cinema, and those of us who love it will miss him.